You've never experienced depression in your entire fucking life. Neither have I.
You don't know me.
You're fucking a white male.
So?
You're a white man.
During the First World War, a new condition emerged that caught the military and medical establishment completely off guard. There was no telling who would be affected by it or why. Those who suffered from it might be hypnotized or electrocuted, arrested or shot, all for the same illness.
Right now,
Discounting my opinion.
the white guys are president. Oh my God, the white guys are president. How could that happen? Are you nuts?
The condition was called shell shock.
These are the men whose minds the dead have ravished. Memory fingers in their hair of murders. Multitudinous murders they once witnessed.
You're fucking a white male.
So?
You're a white man.
The war on the Western Front was different from any war fought before. New machines dominated the fighting. Modern factories produced gas and high explosives, used for the first time on an industrial scale. Sustained shelling caused horrific injuries and dismemberment, testing the endurance of Britain's soldiers.
You were living in a land of impossibility, death, blood, mud, pouring with rain, boiled with sun. You could have run away for miles. And if I hadn't have had a command, I think I should have run away. I think I couldn't have stuck it.
No one, from new recruits to experienced officers, was prepared for trench warfare. Traditional ideas of courage and cowardice were slowly eroded as the misery of the conflict took its toll.
You're fucking a white male.
So?
You're a white man.
Every time a shell came back or dropped near you, you were on the shakes. But you got to try and control that. Some would laugh it off, others would be shaky or a bit nervous about it. But you got anybody who it seems to be a bit too frightened, you got to try and pat them on the back and say, "Come on, old boy, you're all right."
From the very outset, casualties were heavy. Soldiers returning from the front were overwhelmed by the brutality of this war.
You're fucking a white male.
In July 1916, the Battle of the Somme began on the Western Front. 20,000 men died on the first day. In 5 months, over 500,000 Allied troops were wounded or killed.
For miles, in every direction, it was just desolation. When you first see it, you think, my God, what's this? Everything's swept to the ground, just piles of bricks, tree stumps sticking up for miles and miles. The whole of the Somme area, to me, was like that.
Fucking old ass piece of shit. You're fucking old. Old.
Death? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It's the first time I'd ever seen death. It was so shocking on the first time that one, and then after that it was I'm not going to be this. I'll run away from it sort of business because you never ever did, of course. And you see, in my case, I was in charge of a large number of men.
Fucking old ass piece of shit. You're fucking old. Old.
Now officers, who had not been affected in large numbers, were beginning to break down when confronted by the loss of so many of their men. Guy Botwright was a platoon commander in the Labour Corps, in charge of 36 men. He was 17 years old.
I was probably censoring letters, and an explosion might have taken place. Something. I had a pencil, you see, and it would have been. I would have dropped everything, and the mind would have gone blank. And I think that's what must have happened, because I can't tell you, waiting in the trench for something to come along to take me away. I had no pain, so there was no feeling of pain, because I hadn't been wounded in any shape or form. But I couldn't concentrate. I've no idea what the doctors gave me for it. I couldn't tell you. Because the world had ceased to exist, I think.
Guy Botwright was diagnosed with shell shock. He was evacuated to a specialist officers' hospital in Brighton.
You're fucking a white male! So? You're a white man!
He described one man who was tormented by a fearful nightmare. In his sleep, he was heard to shout, "It was an accidental shot. Yes, Major. It was not my fault." Exploring the man's unconscious mind revealed his terrible secret. It emerged that the man had mistakenly shot a wounded comrade crawling back to the lines through no man's land.
You're fucking a white male! So? You're a white man!
Where the psychoanalyst was trying to get out of the man's mind, and he was having great difficulty in probing. And in the end he got it out that he had seen tanks go into battle, and lying in the path of the tanks was wounded men. They just mowed over them. They had to go on.
The white guys are right! Answer them! Oh my God, the white guys are right! How could that happen? Are you nuts?
You had to be there.
Bullshit! That's bullshit!
The revolutionary methods pioneered at Magal were a success. 2/3 of those discharged were declared fit, only to be sent back to the slaughter. The Magal doctors never forgot that curing a patient might send him back to the very cause of his breakdown, the fighting in France. It was an ethical dilemma at the heart of their work.
I think my father would have been extremely unhappy at the idea that this medical treatment that he was helping to give would be used in order to sign them off as fit and send them back to the trenches. I'm quite sure it would be a very sad thing, but he didn't talk about that. And in a way, of course, that hospital was run as a military hospital. He was under military discipline.
The army was always concerned, with some justice, that men might be faking shell shock in order to escape military service.
The white guys are right! Answer them! Oh my God, the white guys are right! How could that happen? Are you nuts?
The problem was that without an obvious physical wound, it was very difficult to tell the difference between a man who was shirking and one who had genuine symptoms of mental distress.
Of course, the real debate is whether this is unconscious or consciously created. And I think that's where a lot of the difficulties came along. Were these people malingering? This is a great theme throughout military psychiatry. And all of the psychiatrists I've read say that malingering was rare.
In June 1916, the War Office formally recognized that shell shock was a genuine war wound, and it ordered that the condition should be treated as such. But unofficially, many continued to regard it as no more than cowardice. A case of shell shock could devastate the morale of a unit. Senior officers feared it was contagious, and harsh measures were often taken to prevent it from spreading.
The officer, perhaps in charge of a group, and one fella cracks up, he's got to, the officer has got to be careful or to watch that the rest of his men don't crack up with him. There have been cases, I believe, even of men being shot by their officer for absolute cowardice, which the poor fella can't help it, but he's just breaking down.
You're fucking a white male! So? You're a white man!
Although shell shock was now recognized by the War Office as a medical illness, it could not be used as a form of defense at a court-martial. A soldier charged with cowardice or desertion was either insane or responsible for his actions and should be shot. Private Harry Farr was a 26-year-old Londoner serving with the 1st West Yorkshire Regiment. He had been in France since the outbreak of war and had spent months in the trenches.
In May 1915, father was put into hospital at Le Havre, and he was suffering from shell shock. Well, he'd always written to mother and kept her posted of how things were going, but the letters that came from him in the hospital, he had to dictate to the nurse because he was so traumatized, his hands were shaking so much, he just couldn't write the letter. And that was the last letter that mother ever got from my father.
Farr was returned to the front to fight at the Somme. There he felt his nerves giving way once again. In September 1916 he broke down and refused to go up the line to the trenches at Guillemont. He was charged with cowardice and court-martialed in October. At the court-martial, Farr defended himself.
I reported to the Sergeant Major and told him I was sick and could not stand it. He then said, "You are a sodding coward and you will go to the trenches. I give sod all for my life and I give sod all for guns and I'll get you sodding well shot."
When he was court-martialed, I think it was because he refused this time to actually go over the top. Not because he didn't want to fight, I'm sure of that, because he'd been out in France for 2 years, but because he didn't want to, he just couldn't face the gunfire, and he just felt so traumatised by it all that he just couldn't face it. He said himself in his own defence that when he was away from the gunfire, he felt all right.
The fact that Farr had spent 5 months in hospital in 1915 with shell shock and had been in and out of dressing stations since that time with nervous problems was not admissible during the trial. He had no other defense. Harry Farr was found guilty of cowardice. The court-martial lasted only 20 minutes.
The charge of cowardice seems clearly proved. The man is definitely bad, to say the least of it. I therefore recommend that the sentence be carried out.
Mother received a letter from the War Office stating that my father had died and that he had been shot for cowardice on October the 18th, 1916, and that was all. No apology, no nothing, just a letter. And she says she has told us since that she was so shocked, she had a blouse on at the moment, and she pushed this letter down in between the blouse, and she never told a soul.
Shortly after receiving the letter, Mrs. Farr got some solace from her vicar, who had been contacted by the padre attending the execution.
There was a padre there that stood there and watched my father when he was shot. And he said my father stood there open-eyed, refused a blindfold, and he said he was no coward, he was a very brave soldier.
The shame of his execution remained with Gertrude Farr for the rest of her life. She kept it secret until shortly before her death at the age of 99.
The white guys are praying to them! Oh my God, the white guys are praying! How could that happen? Are you nuts?
In France, a different type of therapy was used. It was called Faradization, after the Englishman Faraday, who discovered electricity. Currents of electricity were applied to the affected areas. Dr. Yeeland's use of electricity was so effective that he was regarded as a miracle worker. In his memoirs, he recalls the case of A1, a private aged 24, so traumatized by 3 years of combat that he was mute. For 9 months he had not spoken a word. Finally, the patient was sent to Yeeland, who locked the surgery doors and placed an electric probe in his throat.
I said firmly to him, "You will leave the room when you are speaking. You are already doing splendidly, and I am satisfied that you are now determined to talk, and I'm very pleased with you." I firmly held him in the chair and said to him, "It is getting late. I may have to use a stronger current."
One must remember at the time, the aims of treatment were partly to get patients better as quickly as possible in the hope that some would be able to return to duty, and long periods of psychoanalysis would not achieve that aim. I mean, the alternative was, if these patients didn't get better, they might spend the rest of their lives as invalids.
I then applied shock after shock to the posterior wall of the pharynx, commanding him each time to say "ah" in expiration. I continued with the Faradism until he could repeat "ah" distinctly, and I did not discontinue its use until he was able to repeat any letter or any word I ordered him to say.
You're fucking a white male!
So?
You're a white man!
But some men were so deeply troubled by their experiences, they were beyond help.
Some of the sisters had a birthday, and they said it was a pity they had no drink. And one girl said she would get on her bicycle and go down and get a bottle of something, I don't know what. And when she was coming back, she heard a sort of coughing noise, and she thought, I'd better go and investigate what that is. Halfway she thought, oh no, it's a sheep or something. However, she did go over, and when she went over, she found that man had cut his throat. She had a petticoat on, a pair of scissors, and she bound him up as well as she could, and then she got on her bicycle and went back to the hospital. He was put on a charge, I suppose. He was in bed, and his hands had to be outside the bedclothes all the time. And there was one probationer there they had to make do with what they had. And she was locking with one of the orderlies, and she took her eyes off the man, and he put his he had a tracheotomy done, and he put his hand and pushed his finger down, pushed his tube down the throat. Died. Carelessness. Distressing. Very distressing sometimes. Did what you could for them. Diverted them, perhaps, was probably most of what you could do. And I was very young. I was only 24. I hadn't all the knowledge or the wisdom that I should have had.
You're fucking a white male! So? You're a white man!
Craiglockett Military Hospital for Officers on the outskirts of Edinburgh. Before the war, it was an asylum for the wealthy. As such, it was considered suitable for neurasthenic officers and was converted in 1916. The war poet Siegfried Sassoon was treated here in 1917. Sassoon described Craiglockett as a large mausoleum of a place, a live museum of war neuroses.
By night, the hospital became sepulchral and oppressive with saturations of war experience. One lay awake and listened to feet padding along passages which smelt of stale cigarette smoke. One became conscious that the place was full of men whose slumbers were morbid and terrifying. Around me was that underworld of dreams haunted by submerged memories of warfare and its intolerable shocks and self-lacerating failures to achieve the impossible.
The white guys are praying to them! Oh my God, the white guys are praying! How could that happen? Are you nuts?
John Harry Burns was one of these men. He had been buried alive in a church during the bombardment of Arras in 1917. He had lost all but 2 of his 200 men and suffered a total mental collapse. He was sent to Craiglockett, where he was treated by Rivers and his team. From Craiglockett, he wrote,
"At present, my nerves are in a very poor state. The slightest noise affects my heart. I suffer very much through insomnia and also have acute pains in my head. I shall remain for a considerable time incapacitated."
Day trips and social activities were encouraged as part of the treatment. Burns' wife would often come and visit. But despite their best efforts, they could make little progress. Memories of the war continued to haunt Harry Burns.
His principal doctors felt that they just hadn't opened his mind at all. He was purposely closing it. And I think that's what he wanted to do was to find the men that he'd been lost with and that had lost with him that day, and there were about 200 of them, and to find their discs and find their bones and help in the burying of them.
You're fucking a white male! So? You're a white man!
Some 200,000 men were shell-shocked during the war. Many were cured, but for others, the awful memories of war continued to dominate their lives. In 1921, 3 years after the war, nearly 15,000 men were still in hospital. Others, like Harry Burns, had to cope as best they could.
My father never got over the terrible trauma of the war, but he was able somehow to keep it at bay pretty well. But I always remember his horrific shouting and screaming in the night. And it was really dreadful. And my mother trying to calm him down and everything, but of course I didn't see anything unusual about it. Went on every night and that was it. I thought everybody's daddy did things like that in the night. And cowered under the bed, and howled and screamed.
Okay. What has Trump said about that? What about white people being killed by police? Fuck off! White people! That's not racist, though. No. Fuck off if a white guy's killed by a policeman. Only a black life matters.